The Sherman tank is remembered as the machine that won World War II. It rolled through the deserts of North Africa, the fields of Europe, and the jungles of the Pacific. It gave the Allies speed, numbers, and the power to overwhelm Hitler's armies. But talk to the men who actually fought inside it, and the story quickly changes. Many crews saw the Sherman not as a savior, but as a thin-skinned coffin that burned far too easily. To historians, it's a symbol of American ingenuity and mass production. To its veterans, it could be both a loyal friend and a terrifying gamble. In this video, we'll uncover why the Sherman was praised as brilliant by strategists, yet cursed as awful by the very soldiers who relied on it in battle. To understand why the Sherman was brilliant, you have to look beyond its armor and its gun. On paper, it didn't always impress, but in practice, it was one of the most effective machines of the entire war. The first reason was mass production. The United States built over 49,000 Shermans. That's not just a number, where it meant that no matter how many were destroyed in battle, replacements kept coming. Entire units could lose tanks 1 week and be fully equipped again the next. German crews often had better machines, but they were constantly outnumbered. A Tiger tank was terrifying, but against 5 Shermans, the odds began to shift. Second, the Sherman was reliable. German tanks like the Tiger or Panther were engineering marvels, but they were also fragile. They broke down, overheated, or simply refused to start. The Sherman, by contrast, was mechanically simple. Crews could patch it up with field tools, and it would keep running. In the chaos of war, that meant more tanks reached the front lines and more stayed there. Third, logistics. The Sherman was designed with supply in mind. Parts were standardized across thousands of vehicles, meaning a broken track or engine could be swapped quickly. Fuel was easy to find. Mechanics trained on one Sherman could repair almost any Sherman in the world. For an army spread across continents, that was priceless. And finally, mobility. The Sherman wasn't the heaviest or the most armored, but it was fast, maneuverable, and adaptable. It fought in the deserts of North Africa, the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the mud of Italy, and even the volcanic ash of the Pacific Islands. Wherever soldiers went, the Sherman could follow. That combination, numbers, reliability, logistics, and mobility, made the Sherman brilliant. It was never about being the strongest tank in the fight. It was about always having a tank ready to fight at all. But for all of its strengths, the Sherman had a dark side, and for the men inside, that dark side could be deadly. The first problem was armor. By late 1942, the Sherman's relatively thin plating was no match for German anti-tank weapons. A Panther or Tiger could destroy a Sherman from over a mile away, while the Sherman often had to close the distance just to stand a chance. In the wide open fields of France or the frozen plains of Russia, that usually meant the Sherman was spotted and destroyed long before it could fire back. Even smaller German guns, like the deadly 88mm flak cannons, tore through Shermans with ease. Then came the gun. The early Sherman carried a 75mm cannon. It was fine against infantry, bunkers, and older Panzer models, but hopeless against the thick hides of Germany's new heavy tanks. Crews sometimes fired round after round at a Tiger with little effect, while one return shell from the German side could rip straight through a Sherman's armor and set off its ammunition. For a crew under fire, that imbalance was terrifying. The result was brutal casualty rates. German tankers came to see Shermans as easy kills, and Allied crews gave their own machines grim nicknames. The British called it the Tommy Cooker because it cooked its crew alive. American soldiers nicknamed it the Ronson Lighter after the cigarette ad that promised lights first time, every time. Once fuel or ammunition was hit, the entire tank could erupt in seconds. Survivors recalled watching their friends' Shermans burst into fireballs after a single strike. And perhaps worst of all was the psychological toll. Tankers climbed into battle knowing the odds were stacked against them. Many described it as going into combat inside a thin-walled tin can, praying they wouldn't meet a Tiger or Panther around the next corner. They relied on numbers, tactics, and luck, but deep down, most knew that surviving a direct engagement was never guaranteed. For the generals, the Sherman was a weapon of strategy. For the men inside, it was often a gamble with their lives, a mix of courage, duty, and sheer hope. To really judge the Sherman, you have to see it in the shadow of its German rivals. The most feared of them all was the Tiger. With armor up to 4 inches thick and a devastating 88mm gun, it could destroy a Sherman before the American crew even spotted it. In a one-on-one duel, the Tiger was almost always the winner. Then came the Panther. It wasn't quite as massive, but its sloped armor and high-velocity 75mm gun made it nearly as deadly. Even the older Panzer IV, once considered outdated, had been upgraded with better armor and weapons that kept it dangerous throughout the war. On paper, these German tanks looked unbeatable. They were superior in firepower, in armor, and in intimidation. Many Sherman crews described the sheer dread of hearing a Tiger's engine rumble or catching the sharp outline of a Panther through the smoke. Yet those advantages came at a steep price. Tigers and Panthers were incredibly complex machines. They were expensive, slow to produce, and prone to constant breakdowns. A Tiger might take weeks to repair after a mechanical failure, if the parts were even available. Fuel shortages left many heavy tanks stranded, sometimes destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. By contrast, a Sherman could be patched up by field mechanics in hours and sent straight back into combat. Numbers told the bigger story. Germany built only about 1,300 Tigers and 6,000 Panthers. The United States produced over 49,000 Shermans. That meant Shermans were everywhere, leading armored thrusts, supporting infantry, plugging defensive lines, and surrounding strongpoints. A German crew might knock out a single Sherman, maybe 2 or 3 in a row, but more kept coming, and soon the battlefield tilted. This is where the Sherman proved its worth. War isn't just about the most powerful machine on paper. It's about balance, combining production, logistics, and staying power. The Tiger was terrifying, the Panther was lethal, but they were too few and too fragile. The Sherman was available in overwhelming numbers, simple to fix, and always ready for the next fight. In the end, it wasn't perfection that mattered, it was persistence. And persistence is how the Sherman helped win the war. For all its flaws, the Sherman was far from a static design. One reason it stayed relevant was the constant stream of upgrades and adaptations that turned a vulnerable tank into a versatile family of machines. The most famous of these was the British Sherman Firefly. By removing the original gun and replacing it with the powerful 17-pounder, the Firefly suddenly gave Allied crews a fighting chance against the Tiger and Panther. German tankers quickly learned to fear it. In fact, Fireflies were often singled out as priority targets because they were among the only Shermans that could reliably punch through German armor at long range. To Allied crews, the Firefly was more than just another tank. It was proof that the Sherman could evolve to meet new threats. Another important upgrade was the Jumbo Sherman. This version carried extra armor, sometimes nearly doubling the protection of the original design. It was heavier, slower, and less agile, but in return it could take hits that would have destroyed a standard Sherman. The Jumbo became especially valuable in defensive actions, where survival was worth more than speed. For crews who had grown used to the nickname Ronson Lighter, the added security of the Jumbo brought a level of confidence that had been missing before. But the real strength of the Sherman was its adaptability. Engineers used the basic chassis to create an astonishing range of specialized vehicles. There were flamethrower Shermans capable of clearing bunkers and fortified caves with terrifying effectiveness. There were rocket-firing Shermans that acted as mobile artillery platforms. There were mine-clearing Shermans fitted with heavy rollers or chains to carve safe paths through deadly terrain. In almost every theater of war, a variant of the Sherman was developed to answer the specific challenges soldiers faced on the ground. This flexibility gave the tank a second life. While German heavy tanks were limited to narrow roles, the Sherman became a universal tool. It was never the strongest, never the most armored, and rarely the most feared, but it could be adapted to almost any job, and that made it indispensable. In a global war, being versatile was often just as valuable as being powerful. Even after the Second World War ended, the Sherman story was far from over. While many wartime designs were quickly scrapped or replaced, the Sherman continued to serve in conflicts across the globe. During the Korean War, Shermans once again rolled into battle. By then they were outclassed by more modern Soviet-built T-34s, but with upgrades and American logistical support, they still managed to hold their ground. In the desperate fighting of the early 1950s, the same tank that had fought through Normandy and the Ardennes was suddenly climbing the hills of the Korean peninsula, proving that the design still had life left in it. The Sherman also found its way into the Middle East. Nations like Israel relied heavily on surplus Shermans during the late 1940s and 1950s. Modified with better guns and armor, they fought in multiple Arab-Israeli wars and helped shape the early history of the region. In South America, Shermans remained in service for decades, becoming the backbone of armored forces in countries that couldn't afford newer machines. Even into the 1970s and 1980s, Shermans could still be found guarding borders and training soldiers. This astonishing longevity came from the same qualities that had made it so effective in World War II: reliability, simplicity, and adaptability. While other tanks became obsolete almost as soon as the war ended, the Sherman endured because it could be repaired, modified, and operated with relative ease. A tank that was never considered the best somehow became the most practical, and so the Sherman earned its reputation as the workhorse of the Allied armies. It was never glamorous, and it certainly wasn't perfect, but it was always there, always ready, and always available in numbers that mattered. In the great contest of industrial power, the Sherman became a symbol of how mass production, smart logistics, and relentless persistence could defeat even the most advanced engineering. The Tiger may live on in legends, but the Sherman lives on in history, not as the strongest tank, but as the one that truly shaped the outcome of the war and the decades that followed. So in the end, the Sherman wasn't the best tank of the war. It wasn't the strongest or the most heavily armed, and it wasn't the machine soldiers dreamed of fighting in, but it was the right tank for the time. Brilliant in its numbers and reliability, yet awful for the crews who faced the terror of battle inside it. The Sherman shows us that victory doesn't always belong to the best machine, it belongs to the machine that can endure. For generals, the Sherman was a weapon of strategy. For historians, it became a symbol of industrial might. But for the men inside, it was something far more personal, a test of courage, survival, and sheer luck. And now, I'll leave you with a question. Would you rather have fought in a Sherman, relying on numbers and support, or in a Tiger, relying on power, but almost no backup? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to subscribe for more military archive stories.